Before the thunder of steel and smoke, before the shriek of whistles and the pounding of pistons, there was silence. A vast silence, sprawling, sacred, and ancient. From the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean, this land stretched untouched by industrial hands. Wild prairies, towering mountains, red rock deserts, and evergreen forests. It was a canvas untouched by rail, painted by nature, and guarded by the spirits of those who had walked it for thousands of years. The land belonged to no man, because it belonged to all life. This was indigenous America, home to the Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Apache, Shoshone, and countless other tribes. Their stories weren't written in books, but in the soil beneath their feet, in the stars above, and in the rivers that whispered through valleys. They knew every hill, every bend, every trail. To them, land was not property, it was family. But far in the east, in cities brimming with factories and ambition, another vision was rising, louder, colder, and hungrier. Manifest destiny had taken hold of the American imagination. The belief that it was the nation's divine right to expand westward, no matter the cost. And in the minds of politicians and tycoons, there was one machine that could conquer the continent: the iron horse, the steam locomotive, a beast of steel and fire, capable of linking oceans, crossing mountains, and delivering goods, people, and power at unimaginable speed. But first, a path had to be carved, a scar cut across the body of a continent. Then came a signature. One man, one pen, one moment. In 1862, in the very heart of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act at a time when the nation was literally at war with itself. When brother was killing brother, when the Union seemed to hang by a thread, Lincoln saw the future. He saw a railroad that would not only connect east to west, but reconnect the soul of a torn nation. The law offered massive government loans and free land to any company that could build the tracks. Two companies stepped forward: the Union Pacific Railroad, which would begin in Omaha, Nebraska, and lay track westward across the Great Plains, and the Central Pacific Railroad, starting in Sacramento, California, tasked with pushing eastward through the deadly Sierra Nevada mountains. Their mission: to meet somewhere in the middle. But this was no simple construction project. This was an epic endeavor, unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would require moving thousands of tons of steel, cutting through granite mountains, bridging rivers, crossing deserts, surviving brutal winters, and fighting both nature and man. It would take blood, it would take sacrifice, and it would take lives. But from the very beginning, this was not a project built on unity. It was built on division, divided by race, divided by wealth, divided by who would profit and who would suffer. Because those who dreamed up the railroad were not the ones who would build it. The hands that would lay the tracks, swing the hammers, and die on the job would not belong to senators or CEOs. They would belong to the Irish, the Chinese, the freedmen, the Mexican laborers, and the unseen. And for the native peoples, this was not a marvel of human progress. It was the beginning of the end. The Iron Horse would not just cut across land, it would cut across worlds. Two companies, two visions, one brutal contest. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, tasked with the impossible: to conquer a continent with rails. But this wasn't a partnership, it was a battle. Each company was paid by the mile. The more track they laid, the more land and government money they earned. And so began a ruthless, mile-by-mile war. A race of speed, cost-cutting backdoor deals, and human lives. The Union Pacific, laying track west from Omaha, faced endless stretches of the Great Plains. Flat and open, yes, but far from easy. They built through blistering summers and frozen winters, and through the heart of lands held sacred by native tribes. These rails weren't just intruding on geography. They were tearing into centuries of native culture. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others saw the train not as a marvel, but as a monster. One that brought hunters, settlers, soldiers, and slaughter. To them, the Iron Horse was death wrapped in smoke, and they fought back. Attacks on work crews became common. Supply trains were raided, bridges destroyed. Surveyors vanished into the grasslands, but the Union Pacific kept pushing forward, backed by the might of the U.S. military. For every clash, retaliation came swift and brutal. The U.S. Army was sent not just to protect the workers, but to pacify the tribes. In the name of progress, villages were burned, treaties broken, and nations pushed westward. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific Railroad began its battle in the west, but theirs was not against warriors. Theirs was against nature itself. From Sacramento, they looked east and saw the Sierra Nevada rising like a wall of stone and snow. No railroad had ever crossed mountains this fierce. The granite was so hard, it shattered tools. Avalanches wiped out entire camps. Snow piled up 30 feet deep in places. Tunnels needed to be blasted, inch, by hand. And there weren't enough workers. White laborers refused the job. Too dangerous, too cold, too deadly. So the company turned to a people desperate for work. A people already hated, already blamed, already invisible. They turned to the Chinese. At first, Central Pacific doubted they could endure. But the Chinese proved them wrong again and again and again. They showed up, they endured, they delivered. More than 15,000 Chinese men would eventually work on the railroad, 3/4 of the entire Central Pacific workforce. They were given the most dangerous jobs, tunneling through solid rock, hanging from cliffs with baskets of explosives, clearing snow by hand. Paid less, fed worse, beaten, mocked, denied recognition. And yet they never stopped. Their quiet discipline, their endurance, their suffering became the backbone of the greatest engineering project America had ever seen. But history, for decades, would barely whisper their names. Between these two companies, a grim unity formed, an agreement that progress would be fueled by the lives of those with the least to lose. Irish immigrants fleeing famine in the East, Chinese laborers escaping poverty and war in the West, former slaves looking for freedom, poor white Americans seeking survival. And all the while, the land itself screamed beneath the weight of steel. For every mile of track, there was a price, a finger lost, a back broken, a life extinguished. And as the tracks grew longer, so did the gap between those who built it and those who would profit from it. At the top, railroad barons, Collis Huntington, Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, Thomas Durant, grew rich beyond measure. They never swung a hammer, never froze in a mountain pass, never faced a Comanche raid on a rail camp. But they signed the checks, and when the rails met, they would claim the glory. Beneath the roar of the Iron Horse, beneath the headlines and celebrations, lay the real story. A story carved not in steel, but in flesh, bone, and silence. To the outside world, the Transcontinental Railroad was progress in motion. But to those who built it, it was survival wrapped in suffering. Let's return to the Central Pacific, where men stared up at the towering walls of the Sierra Nevada and saw not just a mountain range, but a graveyard waiting to be filled. These weren't hills to climb. They were giants to kill. And the men chosen to fight these giants, the Chinese, they came by the thousands. Most were poor peasants from southern China, escaping war, famine, and disaster. Some had no names on record, just numbers or nicknames. They were promised wages. They were promised opportunity. But what they were given was something else. They worked in snow so deep, it swallowed buildings. In tunnels so dark, they couldn't see their own hands. They dug through solid granite inch by inch, using hand drills and black powder. Later, they handled nitroglycerin, a deadly explosive so unstable that even a bump could cause instant death. To blast tunnels, they were lowered in baskets over cliffs, hundreds of feet high, swinging like prey, while placing explosives into the mountain's chest. Many never came back up. The Summit Tunnel, a 1,659-foot gash through the heart of the Sierra, took over a year and a half to complete. Temperatures dropped below zero. Winds howled like wolves. Snow buried camps. Avalanches killed dozens in a single breath. And yet they did not stop. The Chinese workers built miles of snow sheds, wooden tunnels, to protect the track from snowdrifts. They invented systems of teamwork and timing, rotating crews with military precision. They were disciplined, efficient, and astonishingly brave, but in the history books, they were often left out entirely. On the other side, the Union Pacific pushed through Nebraska and Wyoming, facing different demons. The flatlands gave way to harsh winters, swollen rivers, and rising resistance, and the workforce there was no less burdened. Many were Irish immigrants, refugees from famine and war. They had survived coffin ships, starvation, and discrimination. But here, they found another kind of battle. Rail camps were rough, violent, and lawless. Men drank hard, fought harder, and died young. Disease swept through camps. Accidents were common: a misstep around a moving rail car, a crushed limb, a blast gone wrong. Some workers earned just $1 a day, risking everything for a wage that barely fed their families. Others were freed, black men, newly emancipated, looking for a future in a country that barely acknowledged their humanity. They shoveled coal, laid track, and manned supply trains, often while dodging bullets from both enemies and former slaveholders, and alongside them, Mexican and native workers. Some forced into labor, others with no better choice, toiled in silence. They weren't mentioned in ceremonies. They weren't photographed for newspapers. They were invisible, but essential. For every mile of track, it's estimated that 4 to 5 men died, from explosions, from collapses, from disease, from exposure. Here were no official death records kept for Chinese workers. Some estimates say hundreds, others say thousands. Their graves often unmarked, their stories buried with them. But without them, this railroad, this monument to ambition, would not exist. Still, the engine roared forward, powered by ambition, greed, and the sweat of those never meant to share in its reward. As rails stretched across the map, they crossed not just rivers and deserts, but the boundaries of morality. What was the price of connection? What was the cost of speed? They called it the age of innovation. They called it destiny. They called it triumph. But beneath every railroad tie lay the heartbeat of a man whose name we'll never know. This wasn't just engineering. This was sacrifice, buried beneath the surface. As the iron horse thundered westward, it didn't just slice through mountains and deserts. It ripped through the heart of a people. The Transcontinental Railroad promised unity, prosperity, and progress. But for the native nations of the American West, it brought something else. For centuries, indigenous tribes had lived with the land, not over it. Their trails were carved by buffalo, not engines. Their lives were guided by seasons, spirits, and sacred places, not timetables or rail schedules. But to the railroad barons, this land was empty, unused, untapped, just space waiting to be civilized and sold. And so, mile by mile, steel rails trespassed through sovereign territory. Hunting grounds became train yards. Sacred mountains were dynamited. Rivers that once nourished tribes now carried steam engines. This wasn't just expansion, it was invasion. The resistance came quickly and fiercely. The Cheyenne, Lakota, Pawnee, Arapaho, Comanche, they didn't just watch their world vanish. They fought back. Rail crews were ambushed, tracks were ripped up, telegraph lines cut. Surveyors disappeared into the tall grass, never seen again. To the tribes, the Iron Horse was a monster, breathing fire, shrieking across the land, bringing endless settlers, soldiers, and slaughter in its wake. And what did the U.S. government do? It answered with force. The U.S. Army was sent in not to build, but to destroy. Entire regiments were stationed to escort track layers and protect railroad property. But protecting progress often meant erasing resistance. Native villages were burned to the ground, horses shot, food stores destroyed, and the buffalo, the very backbone of Plains culture, were hunted not for meat, but for extinction. Millions of buffalo were slaughtered, not just to feed workers, but to starve tribes. Rail passengers were even given rifles so they could shoot buffalo from the train cars, a sport that left the plains littered with rotting carcasses. Progress, it seemed, demanded genocide. Meanwhile, the tycoons behind the railroads grew obscenely rich. Thomas Durant, the head of Union Pacific, ran scams so bold, Congress couldn't keep up. He created a fake construction company, Credit Mobilier, which overbilled the government by millions, while workers went unpaid and underfed. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and the Big Four of the Central Pacific became some of the wealthiest men in America. Their profits soared, even as their workers died by the hundreds. They weren't building a railroad, they were building empires. And the government, they let it happen. Why? Because they believed in the dream of a coast-to-coast America, a connected nation, a modern nation. And what's a few thousand lives? What's a few hundred cultures when weighed against progress? Then in the rail camps, violence ruled. Workers lived in squalor. Gambling, alcohol, and disease were rampant. Brawls broke out daily. Irish laborers clashed with black freedmen. Chinese workers were abused by supervisors and often placed in the most dangerous jobs without protection or rights. There was no law, only the whip, the gun, and the clock. Time was money, and men were expendable. Some companies paid bonuses for laying more track, which meant crews worked 16-hour days in freezing cold or burning heat, driving iron through earth like machines until their bodies gave out. Some men collapsed mid-swing. Others vanished in the night, too injured or too broken to keep going. No plaques mark their graves. No statues bear their faces. Just the tracks they left behind. So when you hear the word Transcontinental, don't just think of golden spikes and glory. Think of the blood on the rails, the buffalo bones left to rot, the tribes pushed from their lands, the men buried under snow and sand, the souls burned in the name of speed. Because while America was being built above ground, it was being buried underneath. This was the true cost of the Iron Horse. It did not just roar, it devoured. May 10, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah, a quiet stretch of open land, suddenly alive with people, banners, and anticipation. After 6 relentless years through blood, blizzards, and bone, the impossible was finally within reach. 2 railroads, 2 armies of laborers, 1 final spike, the Golden Spike. They say it was a moment of triumph, a symbol of unity. East meets West, steel meets steam. America, at last, connected from sea to shining sea. And in that photo, the one you've probably seen in textbooks, men smile beside their locomotives, holding bottles, shaking hands, a manufactured image of harmony. But the truth was more complicated, more haunting, more human. On one side, the Union Pacific, having laid track west from Omaha, Nebraska, its workers, mostly Irish immigrants, freedmen, and Civil War veterans, had crossed rivers, plains, and hostile terrain. They endured attacks, drunken brawls, and corrupt management, but they made it. On the other, the Central Pacific, laying east from Sacramento, their workforce, largely Chinese laborers, had faced a different hell. Granite mountains, deadly snowstorms, avalanches, and isolation. And yet, when the final photograph was taken, none of the Chinese workers were invited to stand in the frame. Not one. They had built more than 690 miles of track, blasted through the Sierra Nevada, carried supplies on their backs across snow-covered cliffs, and they were pushed aside at the finish line. Why? Because history isn't just written by the victors, it's posed by them. At 12:47 p.m., a ceremonial golden spike was driven into a polished laurel tie. Telegraph wires carried the message. Done. The nation erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, cannons fired, cities declared holidays. People believed they were witnessing the birth of a new era, and America finally united. But for many, that unity came at a cost they would never recover from. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews weren't celebrating. They weren't even allowed in the crowd. Instead, they were ordered to keep working, to lay sidings and finish grading. One eyewitness wrote, while the dignitaries sipped wine, the Chinese quietly picked up their shovels and walked back to camp. Their reward for 6 years of backbreaking labor, lower pay, no legal rights, and eventual exclusion from American life through laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And the Irish workers? Many drifted into poverty. Some became miners. Others disappeared into the fringes of society, burned out by the railroad, and discarded when the job was done. The final spike wasn't made of just gold. It was forged from contradiction. Progress, yes. Innovation, undeniably. But also erasure, exploitation, and silence. Silence about the cost. Silence about the dead. Silence about the nations broken beneath the wheels. The government handed out millions of acres in land grants, cutting across native territory, stripping tribal sovereignty, turning plains into private property. What the railroad connected, it also divided. What it built, it also buried. And yet, somehow, in all this tragedy, there was also resilience. The railroad workers forgotten in history books left behind something no one could erase. A legacy written in steel. They were immigrants, outcasts, and survivors. They weren't in the photographs, but they were in every mile of track, every tunnel, every trestle, every bridge. When you ride a train across America today, remember, you are not riding comfort, you are riding courage. You are traveling on the backs of those who endured what most would not survive. The Iron Horse had reached its destination, but it didn't just connect the oceans. It forced a reckoning with our values, with our past, with who we remember and who we choose to forget. So before we turn the page to celebration, before we raise our glasses to progress, we must first honor the forgotten, because the golden spike was not the end of the story. It was the moment we chose what kind of nation we would become. And now, the question remains, did we choose wisely? The last spike was driven. The train whistles faded. The crowds cheered, then scattered. And the dust of Promontory Summit settled into history. But the Iron Horse did not rest. Its legacy kept moving, not just on rails, but through the bloodstream of a young, hungry nation. With the railroads came a new kind of power. Not just mechanical economic, political, and cultural. It changed everything. And it changed everyone. Within a few years, cities exploded along the tracks. Cheyenne, Denver, Salt Lake City, Sacramento, places once called wilderness, became new centers of commerce. Goods could now travel faster than ever before. Oranges from California, steel from Pittsburgh, cattle from Texas. It was the beginning of a national market, and America became one economy, bound by iron and time. Farmers, once isolated, could now sell grain hundreds of miles away. Mail arrived in days, not weeks, and people, millions of them, followed the rails westward. But the open land, once promised to everyone, soon became privatized property. Railroad companies had been given over 175 million acres of federal land. They didn't just build railroads. They sold real estate. They sold dreams. And people bought them, not knowing what had been lost, to make room for them. For Native American tribes, this was not progress. This was the final blow. The railroad allowed the U.S. Army to reach even the most remote native lands. Supplies, soldiers, and settlers moved with speed. Resistance became hard to escape, impossible. By the 1880s, most indigenous nations had been driven onto reservations. Their buffalo gone, their sovereignty shattered, their children taken to boarding schools, their languages stripped away. The Iron Horse didn't just run over soil, it ran over cultures. And even today, those scars remain open. For the workers who built it, those nameless hands who bent steel with sweat and blood, recognition came far too late. The Chinese laborers, who tunneled through solid granite, were subjected to violence, exclusion, and decades of racism. It would take until the 21st century for the U.S. government to officially acknowledge their contributions. The Irish, freedmen, and others who toiled on the rails. Many died penniless, buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost to rust and silence. But look closely, and you'll see them in every mile of track, in every spike, in every echo of every passing train. Today, trains still cross the continent, sleeker, faster, but they carry more than just freight or passengers. They carry a legacy of contradiction, innovation and injustice, unity and destruction, progress, and pain. The Transcontinental Railroad was a miracle of engineering. Yes, but it was also a mirror, one that reflected the soul of a nation. A soul willing to dream, but often too quick to forget who paid the price for that dream. So when we speak of the Iron Horse, we must not speak only of its roar. We must speak of the whisper it left behind, in the wind across the plains, in the silence where languages once thrived, in the bones beneath the rails. Because this story, the story of building a nation, is not just about rails and steel. It's about people, people who believed, people who suffered, people who were silenced, and people who endured. The Iron Horse didn't just build America, it defined it. Its tracks shaped the land, its roar echoed through generations, and its cost is still being paid. But maybe, just maybe, if we listen closely, we can still hear the lessons rumbling beneath our feet. Not just about where we've been, but about where we must go next.